Hey guys, it's Kira, and today I'm going to be sharing with you the top 10 books that I read this year in 2018. And for me this was actually quite a hard decision to make. These are all books that I read in the second half of 2018 because in the first half of 2018 I was coming to the end of my English degree, so all of the books I was reading was basically books for my dissertation and for exams and things like that. And while some of them were really good books, they definitely didn't all make it into my favourites. Whereas in the second half of the year, once I had graduated, I read some amazing books, and I think I just really enjoyed getting back into reading for pleasure again, so I was just having a great time. And so it was really hard to narrow it down into the 10 top books of the year, but I managed it eventually, and I've ranked them from the least favourite to the most favourite, and I'm going to share those with you now. So in 10th place is Eleanor Park by Rainbow Rowell, which is a book that I picked up in the booktubeathon and really enjoyed reading. So this is like a teenage love story about two characters, Eleanor and Park, who meet on the school bus when Eleanor is new to the school and Park ends up initially befriending her, and then they become sort of romantically involved with each other. And so in some senses it's quite like a basic teenage love story, though in other senses it's a much more complicated book. You get to see both characters' perspectives, which is something that I really enjoy, and that's one of the reasons this has made it onto my favourites list, because I just love seeing how two characters can experience like the same situation but sort of feel very differently about it. So you get to see Eleanor's perspective, and in her story you get to see a lot of really quite dark things in terms of abuse and neglect and having a really difficult home life. And in Park's life you also get to see some difficult circumstances as well, sort of not knowing how to be himself in front of his family. And I think what was really great about this book is you see these characters who in a lot of ways are very different, but then how they sort of come together and find like a solace within each other and sort of an escape from the difficulties of their home lives and school lives. And all in all, I think this was just a really enjoyable read, and one that I found managed to be both happy and sad at the same time, which is quite a difficult thing to achieve, I think, but this book definitely does it. It's kind of like hopeful in a lot of ways, but then at other points it's quite sad, and the ending is definitely difficult to read, but I did really enjoy this book. I would 100% recommend it if you haven't read it already. But in 9th place is the only book from this list that I actually read as part of my degree earlier this year, and that was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey, which takes place in a psychiatric ward in the 1960s and follows a group of men who are currently patients on the ward as they sort of grow and develop throughout the story. But the reason I found this book to be so interesting is that as well as looking at these men and how they develop and change, what the book really does is present like a really interesting social critique of how the psychiatric system functions in the 1960s, and particularly through the head nurse Ratched, really looks at how positions of authority and people who are in sort of figures of authority can use these sort of positions of power really negatively to manipulate people and break patients down to behave how they think people should behave, as opposed to actually helping the patients to recover and develop and sort of resolve their issues. I just thought it was such an interesting and important critique of how people can really misuse their positions of power, and I just thought all of the characters were so interesting, and I just really enjoyed this book. So in 8th place is another book that I read as part of the booktubeathon, and that was The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, which for me was a really sort of creepy and uncanny gothic novel that I found to be so interesting. It was like one of them books that you just couldn't put down because it was so like unnerving. So this book looks at a character called Dorian, who at the beginning of the book is quite young, beautiful and quite moral, but after one of his friends paints him and also comments on how beautiful he is, he kind of becomes obsessed with the sort of prospect of staying young and beautiful forever, and somehow the painting that was painted by one of his friends starts to take on all of Dorian's negative characteristics. So every time he does something evil and immoral, the painting takes on those qualities and ages and becomes ugly, while he is able to stay young and beautiful and basically have no consequences for any of his actions. So it's a really interesting look at how people can be beautiful on the outside but be very evil and immoral and twisted on the inside. And I think what was so interesting about this book is the way that it sort of focuses on the shallowness of society and how people can have these very shallow and fickle ambitions to be young and beautiful, when actually that has no real effect on what kind of person you are on the inside. So it was a really interesting critique of society and how people can be very fickle and sort of looks focused, when actually we should probably be more focused on how people are on the inside. But it was really interesting and kind of creepy and unnerving, but definitely a really great read. So in seventh place is another Gothic classic, and this time it is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, which I found to be such an interesting book. So this book takes what I think are quite common themes in classics, like romance and families and choosing the right sort of marital partner and class systems, and instead of taking like a positive, happy ending sort of style of narrative, chooses to like twist these common themes into a way to look at the darker side of human nature. So overall, I'd say this book is like a twisted romance that really explores what happens when romance doesn't end well and how it can sort of affect a person's character, and how sort of romance going wrong and not going to plan can really sort of affect how a person then chooses to go about their life. So it's a really, really interesting read that focuses on some characters that are really, really not very likeable, but despite being unlikable are really, really compelling. So it's the kind of book that deals with some really dark and twisted themes and has characters that are so compelling that you just can't help but want to know what happens to them even though you don't like them. So I really, really enjoyed this book and think it's just a really, really gripping read. So moving away from the classics for a little bit, the next book on the list in sixth place is one that I read quite recently, and that was Eleanor Park is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman, which is a book that I was actually so surprised by how much I enjoyed. I know it's a very, very popular read, but I don't read too many books in the sort of like adult contemporary genre, so I wasn't sure what I would think of it, but I absolutely loved it. So this book follows the protagonist Eleanor, who is a very like eccentric and quirky character who lives like a very regimented and quite odd life. Basically, she lives a life that's very, very different from everyone around her, and she's like seemingly quite unafraid to be different, which is quite refreshing, I'd say, in a main character. But as the novel progresses, she does start to try and sort of mould herself into someone who is more socially acceptable so that she can find like a suitable love interest. So on the surface it's quite like a sort of basic story about how someone tries to change themselves to fit in with society and find love, but then underneath the surface themes it deals with some really, really dark themes to do with mental illness and depression and the long-term effects of someone who has dealt with child abuse and neglect and abusive parents, and also growing up in the care system in foster care. So it's a really, really interesting novel that I found like blended together themes that are quite disparate, so things like love and sort of romance and things like that with some really, really dark themes, and it does it so seamlessly. Like it blends together really light-hearted and funny themes with some really, really dark and quite sad themes, and yet it does it just so well. I just found it to be so impactful, and I think that while Eleanor at the beginning of the book seems like a very odd and unrelatable character, by the end of the novel you have really, really connected with her and she's just so compelling. And I think this book is both happy and sad and funny and also really, really thought-provoking all at the same time, and I just found it to be such an impactful and interesting read. So halfway through, in fifth position, is Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier, which I found to be my favourite Daphne du Maurier book that I've read so far. So this book follows a girl called Mary whose mother has just passed away, and she goes to live with her aunt and uncle at their inn called Jamaica Inn. And once she's there, she deals with a moral crisis because it turns out that some very, very immoral things are happening at Jamaica Inn, and she has to deal with what she's wanting to do with the information that she's slowly learning. So in many ways this book is quite mysterious because you sort of follow along with Mary and learn about what's happening with Jamaica Inn as the book goes along. So it's really, really compelling because you don't know all of the information all at once and you have to keep reading to find out exactly what's going on. So that's sort of the main thing that I really enjoyed about this book, is that you sort of find out the dark and gory details as you go. What I also found interesting is just how Mary sort of juggles with her conscience throughout the book and how she really, really isn't sure how to progress. I feel like you definitely connect with the protagonist of this story just because you sort of follow along with her and you can really, really sort of empathise with how she's dealing with the situation. And like all of du Maurier's novels, it's really, really dark, it's creepy, it's twisted, it deals with a lot of dark issues, and it does it in a really, really interesting and compelling way. So in fourth place is a book that I've talked about loads of times on here because I enjoyed it so much, and that was Salton Sea by Ruta Septes, which I found to be such an interesting novel. This is a YA book that looks at 4 people who are all in Germany towards the end of World War II, and they're all trying to escape as the Russian army is sort of getting closer and closer, and they're all trying to sort of escape to safety. So this book looks at 4 different protagonists and you get to see 4 different perspectives. So like Eleanor Park, I find that to be so interesting because you're looking again at 4 people who are experiencing virtually the same situation, but they're all experiencing it in a very different way, and it's really interesting to see how 4 people can be in pretty much the exact same circumstances but deal with it in so many different ways. So in this book you're looking at 4 people who are also from very, very different backgrounds, and for that reason their position in Germany is very, very different, and the way that this could end for them if they don't manage to escape to safety is also very, very different. So it's a really, really interesting look that in sort of a very, very short amount of pages manages to help you see and sort of gain an insight into so many different ways that World War II affected so many different people. So it was a really, really interesting and enlightening book that I just found to be such a great way to look at World War II and give an insight into a variety of different stories all at the same time. So I found it to be so, so interesting. So in third place is another book that surprised me by how much I enjoyed it, and that was The Shining by Stephen King. So this book on the surface is a horror type novel that looks at a family made up of a husband and wife, Wendy and Jack, and their young son Danny, as they go to a hotel in the Colorado mountains to be the winter caretakers. So while they're there, they're dealing with isolation, and it quickly becomes clear that the hotel they're looking after has some really dark paranormal qualities that are exemplified by the fact that Danny seems to have some sort of psychic abilities that are called the Shining, and he can sort of communicate with the hotel. So on the surface it's kind of like a jumpy horror story, but really what I found to be so impactful about this book is that it's not just like a cheap scare type book, and actually really, really delves into the psychological states of all of the family members. And particularly you get to see the effect of the hotel on Jack, who's also dealing with things like alcoholism, a history of violence, a sort of troubled relationship with his dad, and you get to see how the hotel affects his state of mind, as well as seeing how it affects all of the family relations with each other, and how those relations quickly become quite fractured by both the hotel and paranormal elements and the isolation that they're facing by being trapped in this hotel with only each other and the hotel for company. So it's a really, really interesting book that surprised me by how sort of psychologically in-depth it was, and how it really, really delved into the psychological states of all of the characters. And I just found myself to be so gripped and invested in finding out how the characters would end up and how they would sort of eventually be affected by the hotel. So I thought it was just such an interesting and psychologically in-depth book, and I just was so, so interested by it. So in second place is a book that again gripped me by having multiple perspectives, because clearly I'm just a sucker for multiple perspective narratives, and that was 19 Minutes by Jodi Picoult, which I absolutely loved. And this book follows a small town called Sterling in America, which is sort of torn apart by a school shooting that's committed by one of the residents of the town and members of the school community called Peter. So he's a 17-year-old who has decided to commit this school shooting, and throughout the novel you get to see the backstory of Peter as well as many of the other characters from the town, and you get to see how he came to make this decision to commit the school shooting, as well as seeing the sort of aftermath and effects of what happened. So I found this to be a really, really interesting book, because as well as looking at the sort of mindset of the shooter, it also looked at how other members of the town and the sort of community have been affected by the situation, and how they were before, and how the shooting changed them. So I found it to be such a rounded novel, because it really looked at the shooting in a very, very rounded way. It looked at all of the events before, and how the people in the town came to be in the position they were on the day of the shooting, as well as giving a really, really in-depth analysis of everything that happened after the shooting. So I found it to be such a rounded book, and I think it just dealt with it in such an interesting way by giving so many different perspectives, and giving all of those different perspectives in such depth. And I think that is the main thing that made me love this book so much, was just the fact that it dealt with such a difficult issue in such a rounded and in-depth way, and just gave you such depth of perspective from so many different characters. So we've made it to the #1 spot, and for me the best book that I picked up this year has to be Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire by J.K. Rowling, which I absolutely loved. So if you've been watching any of my reading wrap-ups this year, you'd know that I've been reading the Harry Potter series for the first time, and although I've loved and given all of the books in the series 5 stars, I have to say the Goblet of Fire was definitely my favourite. I just absolutely loved this book, and I think the reason why I loved this book so much was because it was definitely a pivotal point in the story, and things started to take a much darker turn, because from the very beginning of the book, Harry starts to feel a lot more pressure and take on a lot more responsibility than he has previously. So it all begins, of course, with his connection to Lord Voldemort, which makes him feel a significant amount of pressure, and then as he has to take part in the Triwizard Tournament, which is something that he shouldn't have to do for another 3 years, he starts to feel again a lot more pressure than he really should. So he starts to take on a lot more responsibility, and things start to get a lot more darker, until obviously the sort of key point in the novel where we see the return of Lord Voldemort. So all in all, the book really signifies a sort of massive change in Harry's character as he has to start to take on a lot more responsibility. But then some of the other elements of this novel that I enjoyed a lot were, of course, the Triwizard Tournament, which was really interesting and different to the sort of scenes at Hogwarts that we're used to seeing from the first 3 books, because things are very different with a whole another sort of set of characters who we're not used to seeing. So that's really interesting, and I also really enjoyed the return of Dobby, who's one of my favourite characters, as well as some other house elves, and Ron's owl Pigwidgeon, who I was a big fan of. I just think he's so cute. So all in all, this book is a really, really interesting read that introduces a lot of new elements to the sort of wizarding world, as well as signifying a really, really interesting and significant turn of events in which Harry has to take on a lot more responsibility. So all in all, I think it is such an important book within the series, and I just loved reading it so much. So those are the top 10 books that I read in 2018, so let me know in the comments below if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them, and if not, let me know what your top read of 2018 was. Thanks for watching, I'll see you next time.